Our story begins today on Naboo in the year 32 BBY. The Naboo and the Gungans are fighting back against the Trade Federation, and in the capital, Qui Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi are fighting against Darth Maul. The Sith Lord has more than held his own against the two Jedi, yet they are now separated by a shield as Maul stalks his prey, while Qui-Gon takes a moment to meditate, as Obi-Wan watches, desperate to protect his master. As Qui-Gon tried to listen to the will of the Force, he saw something horrifying. Anakin, but he was older, and he was on Mustafar. He was in a lot of pain, too. Qui-Gon needed to be there for him. It was too important that he defeat Maul now so that they could defeat the Sith. But then, before he could continue his attack, he saw Obi-Wan, on higher ground. He needed to think. Of course there was risk in training Skywalker, but he was the chosen one. Perhaps what he was seeing was what would happen if Qui-Gon was unable to train him, so when the shield dropped, Qui-Gon was more cautious as he wouldn't charge directly at Maul. He'd be more defensive as Obi-Wan tried to get closer to them. He sensed that the ray shields were about to activate again, and he retreated behind them, as he and Obi-Wan were once again separated from the Sith Lord. Qui-Gon felt the anxiety in Obi-Wan. He was clearly on edge fighting the Sith Lord as it was testing him in ways that his young Padawan had never been tested before. Qui-Gon went to his knees to continue to meditate and forced Obi-Wan to join him. He needed him to center himself. Everything would work the way that it was meant to. But Obi-Wan would still be on edge as he was confused as to how his master could be so calm at a time like this. This was a Sith Lord they were dealing with, and he had just seen his master almost retreating. He knew he would have to be aggressive, to continue to allow his master to catch his breath. So when the shields were up, Obi-Wan immediately went on the attack, putting Maul on his heels as their blades clashed at increasing speeds, with Obi-Wan eventually able to land a strike that would cut Maul's dual-edged lightsaber in half, limiting him to one blade. But as Maul was ready to strike back, Qui-Gon was there too, so Maul had to continue to fall back, and without his second blade, he had fewer opportunities to attack, and with both Jedi still alive, he had to go onto the defense. And with the two Jedi having the Sith Lord cornered, Qui-Gon wanted to take him alive, get him to surrender so they could learn more of the Sith, but Obi-Wan wasn't going to take that chance. His aggressiveness had taken over, this desire to protect his master, and the Sith Lord was stabbed in the stomach as he fell down into the bottomless pit, never to be seen again. Wink. The Jedi were forced to accept that the warrior Maul was a Sith Lord, and Obi-Wan was knighted, as defeating the Sith Lord and protecting his master were his final trials. But there was still one last problem to resolve. What to do with Anakin Skywalker. He had successfully destroyed the Trade Federation's space station, ensuring the battle was won, as he insisted to Qui-Gon that he did what he said by staying in the cockpit, amusing Obi-Wan, who was able to find the young boy much funnier now that he didn't have to be his master. Yoda would decide that Anakin would be trained as a Jedi, knowing that Qui-Gon would train him whether the Council approved or not. At least this way they could keep an eye on the boy, who had proven himself to be very capable and may well be the chosen one. Over the next 10 years, Qui-Gon would train Anakin inside the Jedi Order. Anakin would benefit from having an older master who was more sure of himself, one who could be more flexible on the rules while still maintaining authority and being firm when it was needed. Anakin would still have his frustrations with his master, though, particularly when he thought he was being too hard on him, but this time he would have someone else he could go to, someone who was in the Jedi Order, someone who had become very important to him when so many masters worried he had started too old, and his peers weren't accepting of him because of his background that was so different to theirs. Obi-Wan had become a very good friend for him, someone who could understand when Qui-Gon was being too hard on him, and this time Obi-Wan didn't have to worry about setting as much of an example for Anakin. He would still look out for the boy, of course, but he wasn't his master, so there was a lot less pressure for him. But even though Anakin's friendship with Obi-Wan would lead to him feeling less isolated in the Jedi Temple, Palpatine would still work his way into Anakin's life. He was wary of Qui-Gon being his master, but the boy was too powerful to not try. As all this was happening, though, the galaxy would still be pulled towards the dark side, as the Confederacy of Independent Systems would pull planets from the Galactic Republic, as Count Dooku would be their leader. This would trouble Qui-Gon greatly, that his master seemed to somehow be involved in this rise in the dark side. He had been troubled when he left the Jedi Order, but understood that his former master was distraught by the Republic. But to align himself with Newt Gunray, Qui-Gon didn't want to believe it, but he was worried for his master. And these worries were exacerbated by the attempted assassination of Padme Amidala. She survived, but Qui-Gon would volunteer himself and Anakin to protect her, something that Padme was against, but Palpatine would still need to get her off the planet. It wasn't ideal for him that Qui-Gon would be involved, but there was too much risk. Padme was the leader against the Military Creation Act. He needed her off the planet. After another failed attempt on her life, the Council would decide that Padme would be taken off-world to Naboo, while Qui-Gon would go after her assassin. Qui-Gon wanted to get to the bottom of this, but was wary of all that seemed to be going around the Senator, and was even more worried when he learned that Anakin was being assigned to be her sole protector. It wasn't that he didn't trust the boy. He had proven himself in so many ways, but Qui-Gon knew his apprentice. He knew about the nightmares he was having about his mother. He knew about the attachment he still had to Padme. Qui-Gon would suggest that Anakin and he both should find the identity of this assassin, that whoever was behind this must want there to be war, or that the very possibility of war between the CIS and the Galactic Republic should demand that a very serious discussion be had. Yoda and Windu would share a look. The dark side was clouding their vision, so they knew that Qui-Gon had a point, but there was still the matter of Padme's security. Qui-Gon would then suggest that Obi-Wan protect the Senator from Naboo. The Council would agree, even as Anakin said that he believed he could handle Padme's protection by himself, and that she wouldn't agree to this plan. But the Council was confident in its decision, and as for Senator Amidala, they would have Anakin talk to the Chancellor so that he would give an executive order to her, one that Palpatine was only too happy to do when he learned that Obi-Wan would be taking Padme off Coruscant, as he would also use the opportunity to pull Anakin away from the Jedi, that they didn't trust him, that his master didn't trust him. Anakin and Qui-Gon would eventually make their way to Kamino, as they were the ones who seemed to have lost a planet. How embarrassing. But where things would change is that the two Jedi would succeed in capturing Jango Fett. Guess Obi-Wan has to be embarrassed a little if Kamino is involved. But before they could bring him back to Coruscant, the Trade Federation would strike, capturing the Jedi and freeing Fett, as Palpatine would use the situation to manipulate Jar Jar into giving him emergency powers, as the Jedi and the clones would free Qui-Gon and Anakin, starting the Clone Wars in the process. But the difference here would be that Dooku would be trying to get his former Padawan to join him, that this was how they could save the galaxy from the corruption of the Republic. Qui-Gon would not be moved, though, and would point holes in his logic, that this wasn't who he really was. And Shmi Skywalker would die without her son there, as the young Jedi would be furious with himself for not being able to save her. But he was being held captive by the Separatists. It felt easier to blame them, and while he didn't give in to his first taste of the dark side, his hatred for the Separatists grew much faster. As the Clone Wars would progress, Anakin and Obi-Wan would once again be the faces of the Republic, their heroes saving them, but the rapport with Qui-Gon and Dooku would continue to be a thorn in Sidious's side. He would try to have Qui-Gon killed multiple times, but he would never succeed, and he would also order Dooku to not involve himself when Qui-Gon was present. But this would have the opposite effect, as Dooku would grow increasingly frustrated with his master. He had given so much to him. He knew that he wanted to help the galaxy, yet his Padawan apparently couldn't have a place in this new world. Palpatine needed a plan, and he would get one from the Witches of Dathomir, who had recovered his former apprentice Maul with the help of his brother, Savage Opress. But before he could come up with a plan to weaken Dooku politically before sending Maul at him, Qui-Gon was able to make his final pitch. That what Dooku had done wasn't worth it. That the war can't be what he wanted. And Dooku could do what he wanted if he came back, to bring peace to the galaxy. And Dooku would turn against Sidious, to help the Jedi defeat the Sith, to end the war. Palpatine would panic when he would learn this, and execute Order 66 as he tried to explain in the fallout that the Jedi were betraying the Republic, that they were plotting with Dooku. This wouldn't be as effective, though, combatively or politically, as more Jedi would survive, and the Republic would fracture over this shift in the galaxy. Both the CIS and the Republic would fail to survive, as the Trade Federation and other separatist leaders would side with Sidious, and the planetary systems would side with Dooku. These two new factions would be the Empire, for a safe and secure society, that had to fight against the New Republic. Civil war would continue in the galaxy for years, as the Empire would continue to hunt the Jedi, and the traitors who sided with them, as the Jedi and the New Republic would fight for freedom in the galaxy. The New Republic would struggle at first, as the separatist systems would still be wary of the corruption that had been in the Old Republic, but the delegation of 2000 had realized that the Republic had its problems, especially if Palpatine was able to take over the way that he had, and Bail Organa, Mon Mothma, and Padme Amidala were able to lead negotiations with Count Dooku and the other separatist leaders to create one democratic government. Jedi would also help form the New Republic, as they would all have to come together to defend themselves as the Empire sought to stamp them out. The Empire was the true threat in the galaxy, and they all had to come together if they were going to survive. This would cement Anakin in the light side of the Force, as he would continue to fight for good, as Palpatine was unable to complete his plans with Dooku, and Qui-Gon was able to ruin the plan of the Sith. Maul would prove himself unable to command the droid and clone armies as effectively as Dooku had, as he was undone by his need for revenge on Obi-Wan, who would eventually defeat the Sith Lord, for good this time. And Maul's demise would put Sidious more in the open, especially as the Death Star was being finalized, something the New Republic would learn of and send all their troops to before the planet killer could strike. The ensuing dogfight would take place in the space over Coruscant, as Palpatine would be in command from the Death Star, and the Republic's pilots were led by Master Anakin Skywalker. Man, that felt weird to say. But he would prove himself not only worthy to be a Jedi Master, but that he was the subject of the prophecy. By trusting the Force and blowing up the Death Star with the last Master of the Sith on board, Anakin Skywalker, the Chosen One, who destroyed the Sith as he was trained to do by his master, Qui Gon Jinn. And that's my story for today. I've always wondered how much Qui-Gon would be able to change. I mean, I know George Lucas has always said that if Qui-Gon survives, Anakin doesn't turn, but I've always wondered the how for it, because it almost kind of makes it sound like it was all Obi-Wan's fault when Anakin obviously made his own choices, but, you know, I've always kind of thought that Qui-Gon would still be able to have that impact, even if, you know, it may not be as perfect as a lot of people seem to think so. I dove into that on another video if you want to check that out on my channel, but that's all I've got for you guys today. So if you enjoyed, please drop a like, subscribe if you want more like this, and I'll see you next time on STV.